Hi guys, welcome back to another deep dive into history's most fascinating oddities. Tonight, we're traveling back over 2,000 years to explore the bizarre, amusing, and sometimes downright ridiculous laws that governed daily life in ancient Rome. From regulations about what you could wear, to strict rules about dinner parties, from peculiar marriage customs to unusual business practices, the Roman Empire was filled with legal oddities that would make modern lawmakers scratch their heads in bewilderment. We'll uncover laws that regulated everything from the color of your clothing to the number of guests you could invite to dinner, from how you could mourn the dead to what animals you were allowed to sacrifice. These weren't just dusty legal texts gathering cobwebs in some ancient library. These were real rules that real Romans had to follow every single day, and breaking them could result in fines, exile, or worse. So settle in as we explore the weird, wonderful, and sometimes completely absurd world of Roman jurisprudence. Okay, friends, before you settle in, if you enjoy this kind of deep dive content, then click the like button and don't forget to subscribe. And yes, leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I really enjoy seeing where everyone is listening from. Now dim the lights and turn on the fan, and let's dive into tonight's journey together. The Roman Empire, stretching from Britain in the north to Egypt in the south, from Spain in the west to modern-day Iraq in the east, was a complex tapestry of cultures, traditions, and peoples all bound together under Roman law. But what many people don't realize is just how intricate and sometimes bizarre these laws could be. The Romans were meticulous record keepers, and their legal system was so comprehensive that it formed the foundation for many modern legal systems we use today. However, buried within the serious matters of property rights, criminal justice, and governmental procedure were laws that seem almost comical by today's standards. Let's start with one of the most famous categories of strange Roman laws, the sumptuary laws. These were regulations that controlled what people could wear, eat, and display based on their social status. The Romans were obsessed with maintaining clear social hierarchies, and they used the law to enforce these distinctions in the most minute details of daily life. For example, there were strict regulations about who could wear purple clothing. Purple dye, made from murex shells, was incredibly expensive to produce, and certain shades of purple were reserved exclusively for the emperor and his immediate family. A regular citizen caught wearing the wrong shade of purple could face severe penalties, including hefty fines or even exile from the city. But the clothing laws went far beyond just purple. There were regulations about silk, which was considered so luxurious and foreign that at various times it was banned entirely for men, deemed too effeminate and un-Roman. The silk trade with distant China was seen as draining Roman gold reserves, leading to periodic legal restrictions on its import and use. Senators passed laws declaring that Roman men who wore silk were corrupting traditional values and weakening the empire's military character. Women's jewelry was regulated too. There were laws limiting how much gold a woman could wear at one time, with specific weight restrictions that varied by social class and occasion. During certain periods, women were forbidden from riding in carriages within a mile of Rome unless they were attending religious ceremonies. And even then, the type of carriage, the number of horses, and the decorations on the vehicle were all subject to legal scrutiny. The enforcement of these clothing laws required an entire bureaucratic apparatus. Special magistrates called censors were partially responsible for monitoring compliance with sumptuary regulations, and they could impose fines, confiscate forbidden items, or even strip citizens of their social rank for violations. Informants were sometimes rewarded for reporting violations, creating a system where neighbors might spy on each other's wardrobes. The laws were so detailed that they specified not just what fabrics could be worn, but how much of certain materials could be used in a single garment, what colors could be combined, and even what types of fasteners and decorations were permitted. These clothing regulations extended to footwear as well. Different styles of sandals and shoes were reserved for different social classes, and wearing the wrong type of footwear could immediately identify you as someone who didn't know their place in society. Senators wore special shoes with distinctive markings, while slaves were prohibited from wearing certain colors or styles entirely. Military personnel had their own footwear regulations, with different ranks entitled to different decorations and materials. Even the height of shoe soles was regulated. Platform shoes were sometimes banned as being too extravagant or foreign. The laws about fabric quality were incredibly specific. There were legal definitions for different grades of wool, linen, and other materials, with detailed specifications about thread count, weaving patterns, and dyeing processes. Merchants who sold substandard materials labeled as higher quality could face severe penalties, including exile from the city and confiscation of their entire inventory. Import regulations controlled which fabrics could be brought into Rome from different provinces, with some materials banned entirely during certain periods and others subject to heavy taxes or quotas. These laws weren't just about luxury, they were about maintaining what the Romans saw as proper moral order in society. The Romans believed that excessive display of wealth would corrupt public morals, create dangerous social tensions, and ultimately weaken the state itself. They looked to their ancestors, who they imagined lived simply and virtuously, and saw sumptuary laws as a way to preserve traditional Roman character against the corrupting influences of foreign luxury and wealth.
The Romans also had peculiar laws about hairstyles and grooming that changed frequently based on fashion, politics, and imperial preferences.
During certain periods, men were required to be clean-shaven, with public barbers serving as unofficial enforcers of these regulations by refusing to shave men who hadn't paid their grooming taxes or met other legal requirements. During other periods, beards were mandatory for certain classes of citizens, particularly philosophers and intellectuals, who were expected to maintain a specific scholarly appearance. The emperor's personal grooming choices often influenced these laws. When Emperor Hadrian grew a beard, beards became fashionable and sometimes legally required for men of certain ranks. Women's hairstyles were scrutinized with equal intensity, and the complexity of Roman women's hair arrangements required teams of skilled slaves called ornatresses who specialized in elaborate styling techniques. There were laws about hair color, with certain shades of blonde achieved through imported German hair being restricted to specific social classes. Hair extensions and wigs were regulated, with legal requirements about their quality, origin, and appropriate use. Some periods saw laws against overly elaborate hairstyles that required hours to create and maintain, as these were seen as signs of moral decadence and excessive leisure. The legal requirements for grooming extended to body hair as well. There were regulations about hair removal for both men and women, with different requirements for different body parts and social situations. Public baths employed specialized slaves who provided hair removal services, and these workers were regulated by law in terms of their training, cleanliness, and pricing. The tools used for grooming, razors, tweezers, and various oils and creams were also subject to quality regulations and import restrictions. Barbershops were considered important centers of social life and political discussion, and as such, they were subject to numerous legal regulations. There were laws about what topics could be discussed in barbershops, what hours they could operate, and how they should be maintained. Barbers themselves were licensed professionals who had to meet specific training requirements and could face penalties for spreading gossip, discussing politics inappropriately, or failing to maintain proper sanitation standards. The Romans even had laws about personal odors and perfumes. Different scents were associated with different social classes and occasions, and wearing inappropriate fragrances could be seen as a form of social climbing that violated sumptuary laws. There were regulations about the import and sale of various perfumes and oils, with some scents being so expensive that they were effectively reserved for the wealthy elite. Public officials were sometimes required to avoid certain strong scents that might be considered inappropriate for their dignified positions. Food laws were equally bizarre and detailed, reflecting the Romans' complex relationship with pleasure, morality, and social status. The Romans had regulations about what could be served at dinner parties, how many courses were allowed, and even how much could be spent on a single meal. These laws were enacted during various periods when legislators became concerned about excessive luxury corrupting Roman virtue. During the late Republic and early Empire, there were laws limiting the number of guests you could invite to dinner. No more than a certain number of people could gather for a meal, presumably to prevent political conspiracies from food and wine. The reasoning was that large dinner parties could become venues for plotting against the state, so intimate gatherings were seen as less politically dangerous. The enforcement of dining laws required detailed record-keeping and sometimes involved government inspectors who would show up unexpectedly at private homes during dinner parties. Hosts were required to keep detailed accounts of their expenses, and these records could be inspected by magistrates. The penalties for violating dining laws could be severe, including heavy fines, public humiliation, or even temporary exile from the city. Some wealthy Romans tried to circumvent these laws by hosting multiple smaller dinners on the same evening, but legislators quickly caught on and passed additional regulations to prevent such workarounds. There were also laws about specific foods and their preparation that went far beyond simple dietary restrictions. Peacocks, flamingo tongues, and other exotic foods were sometimes prohibited, not for health reasons, but because they were seen as signs of dangerous moral decay. The importation of certain luxury foods was regulated or banned entirely during various periods. Garum, the fermented fish sauce that Romans loved, was subject to quality regulations and pricing controls, with different grades being designated for different social classes. The most expensive grades of garum were sometimes restricted to specific occasions or social ranks. The timing of meals was also regulated by law. There were legal requirements about when different types of food could be served, with some dishes being designated as appropriate only for specific times of day or particular seasons. The famous Roman banquet tradition of having multiple courses served in a specific order wasn't just a matter of taste. It was often legally mandated. Violating the proper sequence of courses could be seen as a breach of social and legal protocol. Cooking methods were subject to legal scrutiny as well. Certain types of preparation were prohibited or restricted, particularly those that were seen as excessively elaborate or foreign. The use of specific spices and seasonings was regulated, with some being reserved for religious ceremonies or restricted to certain social classes. Professional cooks were licensed and regulated, with legal requirements about their training, cleanliness, and the methods they could employ. Wine laws were particularly complex, as wine played such a central role in Roman social and religious life. There were regulations about wine quality, with detailed legal definitions for different grades and types. The dilution of wine with water was not just a social custom, but often a legal requirement, with specific ratios mandated for different occasions and social situations. The sale of wine was heavily regulated, with licensed dealers required to meet strict quality standards and pricing guidelines. Import regulations controlled which wines could be brought into Rome from different regions, with some areas being granted special privileges, while others faced heavy taxes or outright bans. The storage and aging of wine were subject to legal requirements, with specified conditions for different types and qualities. Wine adulteration was a serious crime, with severe penalties for merchants who watered down their wine beyond legal limits or added inappropriate substances to improve flavor or appearance. The Romans even had laws regulating when and how you could cry, with mourning rituals being strictly controlled by detailed legal codes that varied by social class, relationship to the deceased, and cause of death. Mourning rituals were considered essential to public order and religious propriety, so the state took a keen interest in regulating these practices. There were specific regulations about how long you could mourn a deceased family member, with different periods mandated for different relationships. Parents, spouses, children, and siblings all had different prescribed mourning periods that were legally enforced. The clothing worn during mourning was strictly regulated, with specific colors, fabrics, and styles required for different phases of the mourning process. Women were required to wear particular types of veils and robes, while men had their own mourning dress codes. The progression from deep mourning to lighter mourning to the end of the mourning period was marked by legally mandated changes in clothing that had to be followed precisely. Violating these dress codes during mourning could result in social ostracism and legal penalties. Professional mourners, women hired to wail and lament at funerals, were regulated by extensive laws that controlled their training, behavior, and compensation. These women, called praeficae, had to be licensed by local magistrates and were required to follow specific scripts and behaviors during funeral ceremonies. There were laws about how many professional mourners could be hired based on the social status of the deceased, how loudly they could cry, and what specific lamentations they could perform. The volume and duration of mourning displays were carefully regulated to prevent excessive disturbances to public order. Funeral processions themselves were subject to complex legal requirements that specified the route they could take, the time of day they could occur, and the number of participants allowed. The famous Roman custom of wearing masks representing ancestors during funeral processions was regulated by law, with specific requirements about which families could use which masks and how they should be displayed. The masks themselves had to be accurate representations and were subject to official approval and registration. The disposal of the dead was governed by detailed health and safety laws that reflected practical concerns about disease and public sanitation in crowded urban areas. There were strict regulations about where bodies could be buried or burned, with specific requirements for different types of graves and tombs. The famous Roman roads were lined with elaborate tombs, but the construction of these monuments was subject to detailed legal requirements about their size, location, and decoration. Building codes for tombs were as complex as those for houses, with specifications about materials, drainage, and structural integrity. Cremation, which became increasingly popular among Romans, was subject to its own set of legal regulations. There were laws about where cremation could take place, what materials could be used for funeral pyres, and how the ashes should be collected and stored. The famous Roman custom of keeping cremation ashes in elaborate urns was regulated by sumptuary laws that controlled how expensive these containers could be based on social status. Even the scattering of ashes was subject to legal restrictions, with certain areas being designated as appropriate and others being strictly prohibited. The famous 12 Tables, one of Rome's earliest legal codes, included extensive provisions about funeral expenses and mourning practices, showing just how seriously the Romans took these matters. These laws limited how much could be spent on funerals, what materials could be used in burial goods, and even how much food could be served at funeral banquets. The goal was to prevent ruinous competition among wealthy families while ensuring that proper respect was paid to the dead according to their social station. Marriage laws in ancient Rome were a labyrinth of bizarre regulations and customs that would seem completely foreign today, reflecting the complex social, economic, and political functions that marriage served in Roman society. For instance, there were laws about who could marry whom based not just on social class, but on profession, citizenship status, and even geographic origin. Actors, gladiators, and people in certain trades were prohibited from marrying into respectable families, as their professions were considered infamous under Roman law. These restrictions weren't just social preferences. They were legally enforced prohibitions with real consequences for violators. The concept of connubium, or the legal right to marry, was carefully regulated and didn't extend to all inhabitants of the Roman Empire. Only Roman citizens had full marriage rights, and even among citizens, there were restrictions based on social class and family status. Senators and their descendants faced particular restrictions about whom they could marry, with laws prohibiting marriages to former slaves, actors, or people in other disreputable professions. These laws were designed to maintain the purity and prestige of the senatorial class. There were also curious laws about the marriage ceremony itself that went far beyond simple ritual requirements. Certain words had to be spoken in exactly the right order, using precise Latin formulations that had been established by law and tradition. The timing of the ceremony was regulated by religious law, with certain days being considered unlucky or inappropriate for marriages. The famous Roman practice of signing marriage contracts was subject to detailed legal requirements about witnesses, documentation, and registration with appropriate authorities. The physical requirements for valid marriages were also legally specified. The bride had to be lifted over the threshold not just as a romantic gesture, but as a legal requirement to make the marriage valid and to symbolically demonstrate the transfer of the woman from her father's authority to her husband's. The sharing of bread and water during the ceremony wasn't just symbolic. It was a legal requirement that had to be witnessed and documented. Even the arrangement of the bride's hair and the type of veil she wore were subject to legal specifications that varied by region and time period. Dowries were regulated by complex laws that specified how they should be calculated, what could be included, and how they should be managed during the marriage. There were legal requirements about the documentation of dowries, including detailed inventories of all property, goods, and money included. The management of dowry funds was subject to legal oversight, with husbands required to maintain the value of their wives' dowries and account for any profits or losses. Squandering a wife's dowry could result in serious legal consequences, including requirements to restore the full value from the husband's own property. Engagement customs were also legally regulated, with specific requirements about how betrothals should be arranged, documented, and dissolved if necessary. The exchange of engagement gifts was subject to laws about their value, appropriateness, and what happened to them if the engagement was broken. There were even laws about the minimum and maximum duration of engagements, designed to prevent both hasty marriages and indefinitely prolonged betrothals. The legal age for marriage was strictly defined and differed for men and women. But these weren't just minimum ages, there were also maximum ages, beyond which first marriages were discouraged or penalized by law. The famous Augustan marriage laws included penalties for remaining unmarried beyond certain ages, with bachelors and spinsters facing tax penalties and restrictions on inheritance rights. These laws were designed to encourage population growth and ensure the continuation of family lines that were important to Roman society. Marriage between relatives was subject to complex laws that changed over time and varied based on the specific relationship involved. Marriages between cousins were sometimes permitted and sometimes prohibited, depending on the current interpretation of religious and civil law. The Romans maintained detailed genealogical records to ensure compliance with these restrictions, and violations could result in the marriage being declared invalid and any children being considered illegitimate. The Romans had particularly strange laws regarding adultery and divorce that reflected their complex attitudes toward marriage, morality, and family honor. While divorce became relatively easy for upper-class Romans in later periods, the laws surrounding it were filled with peculiar requirements and procedures that had to be followed precisely to ensure legal validity. For example, a husband who wanted to divorce his wife for adultery had to follow specific legal procedures that included gathering acceptable witnesses, making formal accusations in front of designated magistrates, and providing evidence according to strict legal standards. The definition of adultery itself was legally complex and gender-specific in ways that reflected Roman attitudes about sexuality and family honor. A married woman who had sexual relations with any man other than her husband was committing adultery. But a married man was only considered adulterous if he had relations with another married woman. This legal double standard wasn't just social convention. It was written into law and enforced by the courts, with different penalties for men and women who committed similar acts. But here's where it gets particularly strange. If a husband discovered his wife's adultery and failed to divorce her within a certain legally specified time period, he himself could be charged with a crime for tolerating the adultery. The law essentially required him to end the marriage or face legal consequences himself, including potential prosecution for being complicit in his wife's immoral behavior. This created situations where men were legally compelled to divorce wives they might have preferred to forgive, turning personal family decisions into matters of legal obligation. The grounds for divorce were legally enumerated and quite specific, ranging from adultery and sterility to more unusual grounds like practicing magic or making unauthorized keys to the family home. Some grounds for divorce seem almost trivial by modern standards. A wife could be divorced for attending gladiatorial games without her husband's permission, for walking in public with her head uncovered, or for drinking wine. These weren't just traditional customs, but actual legal grounds that could be used in formal divorce proceedings. The financial aspects of divorce were heavily regulated by law, with complex rules about how property should be divided, who was responsible for debts incurred during the marriage, and how children's inheritance rights would be affected. The return of dowries was particularly complicated, with laws specifying how long husbands had to return dowry property, what condition it had to be in, and what deductions could be made for the wife's alleged misconduct or household expenses during the marriage. Child custody laws in divorce cases were quite different from modern practices and heavily favored fathers, who held legal authority over children regardless of the circumstances of the divorce. However, there were laws about child support and maintenance that required fathers to continue supporting their children financially even if the children remained with their mothers. These laws also specified what role divorced mothers could play in their children's upbringing and what rights they retained to visit and influence their children's education and marriage prospects. The remarriage of divorced women was subject to legal restrictions designed to ensure that any children born after the divorce could be clearly attributed to the correct father. There were legally mandated waiting periods before divorced women could remarry, with different requirements depending on whether the divorce was for adultery, mutual consent, or other grounds. Violating these waiting periods could result in legal challenges to the legitimacy of future children and complications with inheritance rights. Roman law also included provisions for temporary separations that fell short of full divorce, with specific legal procedures and requirements for these arrangements. These separations could be initiated for various reasons, including military service, business travel, or temporary incompatibility, and they required formal documentation and sometimes court approval. The rights and obligations of temporarily separated spouses were legally defined, including requirements for financial support and restrictions on relationships with other people during the separation period. Women in ancient Rome lived under a complex web of legal restrictions that seem almost unbelievable today, reflecting the patriarchal nature of Roman society, but also revealing some surprising nuances in how these restrictions were applied and enforced. For most of Roman history, women were considered perpetual minors under the law, requiring a male guardian called a tutor to conduct any legal business, sign contracts, or make financial decisions. This guardianship wasn't just a formality, it was a legal requirement with real consequences for women who tried to act independently. The selection and role of guardians was itself subject to detailed legal regulations. Guardians were typically male relatives, but if no suitable family member was available, the courts would appoint guardians according to specific legal criteria. These guardians had significant legal authority over their female wards, but they also had legal obligations to act in the women's best interests and could face penalties for mismanaging women's property or finances. The system created complex legal relationships where women could sometimes manipulate or pressure their guardians to approve transactions they wanted to make. But some of the specific restrictions were particularly odd and reflected deep-seated Roman anxieties about female behavior and its impact on family honor and social stability. For example, women were prohibited from drinking wine, not just discouraged, but legally forbidden under penalty of severe punishment. This law was so strictly enforced that a husband was legally permitted to execute his wife if he caught her drinking wine, and such executions were not considered crimes, but rather appropriate enforcement of moral and legal standards. The reasoning behind the wine prohibition was complex and reveals Roman attitudes about female sexuality and moral behavior. Roman legal scholars argued that wine might lead to adultery by lowering women's moral inhibitions, and therefore drinking wine was essentially a form of preliminary adultery in the eyes of the law. This created a legal framework where consuming alcohol was treated as a gateway to more serious moral crimes, justifying extreme penalties for what might seem like minor infractions. Women's legal capacity to own and inherit property was heavily restricted, but not entirely eliminated, creating a complex system where women could be wealthy but couldn't freely manage their wealth. Women could inherit property from their fathers or husbands, but managing, selling, or investing this property required guardian approval and often court oversight. However, some wealthy women found ways to work around these restrictions by carefully managing their relationships with guardians or by engaging in informal business arrangements that didn't require formal legal documentation. The legal restrictions on women's business activities were extensive and covered everything from commercial transactions to professional services. Women were generally prohibited from engaging in most forms of commerce, practicing law, or holding public office. However, there were some exceptions and loopholes that enterprising women could exploit. Some women operated businesses through male agents or family members, while others engaged in activities that were technically legal but socially disapproved. Women's inheritance rights were particularly complex and changed significantly over time. Early Roman law heavily favored male heirs, but later developments allowed women to inherit substantial property under certain circumstances. However, even when women inherited property, their ability to control and dispose of it was limited by guardianship requirements and legal restrictions on female financial autonomy. The result was a system where women could be wealthy but not truly independent. There were also bizarre laws about women and public spaces that restricted where women could go, when they could travel, and what activities they could engage in outside the home. Women were prohibited from attending certain public events, entering specific buildings, and participating in various civic activities. These restrictions weren't just social customs, but legally enforced prohibitions that could result in fines, public humiliation, or other penalties for violations. The legal treatment of women in criminal matters was also heavily gendered, with different standards of evidence, different penalties, and different procedures depending on the gender of both the accused and the victim. Women faced unique criminal charges related to their gender roles, such as neglecting household duties or failing to properly supervise children or slaves. At the same time, crimes against women were sometimes treated less seriously than similar crimes against men, reflecting the lower legal status of women in Roman society. There were also bizarre laws about women and religious practices that created a complex system of inclusion and exclusion based on gender, with some religious activities being completely forbidden to women, while others were exclusively female domains. Women were prohibited from participating in certain religious ceremonies and festivals, with severe penalties for any woman who tried to attend or witness these male-only religious events. The exclusion wasn't just social, it was legally enforced with specific penalties for violations. The festival of Bona Dea, for instance, was so strictly limited to women that any man who even accidentally witnessed the ceremonies could face severe legal penalties, including exile, hefty fines, or public humiliation. This created situations where entire neighborhoods had to be carefully managed during religious festivals to ensure that men were kept away from forbidden ceremonies. The famous scandal involving Publius Clodius Pulcher, who disguised himself as a woman to sneak into these sacred rites, resulted in a major political and legal crisis that rocked Roman society and led to significant changes in religious law enforcement. Women's religious roles were legally defined and regulated in ways that seem almost bureaucratic in their detail. Female priests and religious officials had specific legal requirements about their qualifications, duties, and behavior, both during religious ceremonies and in their daily lives. The Vestal Virgins, Rome's most famous female religious officials, were subject to extremely detailed legal codes that governed every aspect of their existence, from their selection as children through their eventual retirement after 30 years of service. The legal requirements for Vestal Virgins were extraordinarily strict and covered everything from their daily routines to their interactions with family members and the general public. They were required to maintain absolute chastity, with the penalty for breaking this vow being burial alive, a punishment that was legally mandated and occasionally carried out. However, they also enjoyed unique legal privileges that other women didn't have, including the right to own property independently, make wills without guardian approval, and travel freely throughout the city without male escorts. Women's participation in other religious activities was regulated by detailed laws that specified what roles they could play, what ceremonies they could attend, and what religious obligations they had. Some religious festivals required the participation of women from specific social classes or family backgrounds, while others excluded certain categories of women based on their marital status, age, or social standing. The legal framework for these religious activities was so complex that it required specialized knowledge and sometimes legal advice to ensure compliance. The intersection of women's religious activities and civil law created unique legal situations that had no parallels in other areas of Roman jurisprudence. For example, women who served in certain religious capacities had different legal rights and restrictions than ordinary women, but these special provisions only applied during their period of religious service. Religious divorce, the dissolution of religious marriages or obligations, followed different legal procedures than civil divorce, and could have different consequences for property rights and social status. Women's religious activities were also connected to broader legal questions about family honor and social status. A woman's proper fulfillment of her religious obligations could affect her family's legal standing and social position, while religious misconduct could bring legal consequences not just for the woman herself, but for her male relatives who were supposed to supervise her behavior. This created complex webs of legal responsibility and mutual obligation that extended far beyond the individual woman to encompass her entire extended family network. Roman business laws contained their fair share of oddities as well. There were regulations about what times of day certain businesses could operate, with some shops required to close during specific hours for moral or religious reasons. Bakers, for instance, were subject to particularly strict regulations. They were considered so essential to public order that they were practically enslaved to their profession, unable to change careers without special government permission. The law recognized that bread was so crucial to preventing riots that bakers had to be kept at their ovens at all costs. The Romans also had strange laws about pricing and commerce that attempted to control economic activity through detailed legal mandates rather than market forces. During certain periods, there were maximum price laws that set legal limits on what could be charged for various goods and services, with severe penalties for merchants who dared to charge more than the government-mandated prices. Violating these price controls could result in heavy fines, confiscation of goods, temporary or permanent bans from trading, or even more severe punishments, including exile from the city. These price control laws were often so detailed and specific that they bordered on the absurd, attempting to regulate the cost of hundreds of different items with mathematical precision that ignored local variations in supply and demand. There were legal maximum prices for everything, from shoes to haircuts, from wine to writing materials, from basic foodstuffs to luxury imported goods. The complexity of these pricing laws required armies of bureaucrats to implement and enforce, creating opportunities for corruption and arbitrary enforcement that often made the cure worse than the disease. Emperor Diocletian's famous edict on maximum prices in 301 CE was perhaps the most comprehensive and detailed price control system in ancient history, including legal maximum prices for hundreds of different items, with specifications that went down to specific grades of wool, particular types of fish, and different qualities of manufactured goods. The edict included not just prices for goods, but also maximum wages for various types of workers, from common laborers to skilled craftsmen to professional services like teaching and medicine. The enforcement of these price controls created a parallel legal system focused entirely on economic crimes, with special courts, investigators, and punishments for price violations. Merchants developed elaborate strategies to circumvent price controls, including creating new product categories that weren't covered by existing regulations, bundling goods and services in ways that obscured individual prices, and developing informal barter systems that avoided monetary transactions entirely. The government responded with increasingly complex legal frameworks to close these loopholes, creating an economic cat-and-mouse game that was played out in legal terms. The legal penalties for price violations were often severe and could include not just financial punishment, but also physical punishment and social degradation. Merchants caught charging excessive prices might face public flogging, branding, or forced labor in addition to financial penalties. Repeat offenders could be banned from their profession entirely or even exiled from the empire, creating a system where economic crimes were treated as seriously as violent crimes or treason. Quality control laws were equally complex and detailed, with legal standards for virtually every type of good sold in Roman markets. These weren't just general requirements for merchantable quality. They were specific technical standards that defined acceptable materials, construction methods, and performance criteria for different categories of products. Pottery had to meet certain thickness and durability standards. Textiles had to conform to specifications about thread count and color fastness, and metalwork had to meet purity and craftsmanship requirements that were tested by official inspectors. The legal framework for weights and measures was particularly sophisticated and standardized throughout the empire, with severe penalties for merchants who used incorrect or tampered measuring devices. Official standards were maintained in major cities and were checked regularly by government inspectors who had the authority to confiscate false weights and measures and punish their users. The legal requirements for accurate measurement extended to every aspect of commerce, from grain sales measured by volume, to cloth sales measured by length, to precious metals sold by weight. Transportation laws in ancient Rome were equally peculiar and reflected the practical challenges of managing traffic flow, maintaining public order, and preserving infrastructure in a city that grew to over 1 million inhabitants. There were strict regulations about who could use carriages within the city limits and when they could be used, with different rules applying to different types of vehicles and different classes of people. Most wheeled traffic was banned from the center of Rome during daylight hours, with deliveries and private carriages restricted to nighttime hours to prevent the streets from becoming completely clogged with traffic during busy daytime periods. This system meant that Rome's streets were filled with the sound of creaking wheels, clattering hooves, and shouting drivers all night long, making sleep difficult for city residents who had to endure the constant noise of commercial and private transportation moving through the urban streets. The law made exceptions for certain privileged individuals and special circumstances. Emperors, Vestal virgins, and participants in religious ceremonies could use wheeled vehicles during the day, but ordinary citizens had to walk, use litters carried by slaves, or ride horses if they wanted daytime transportation. The regulations governing different types of vehicles were incredibly detailed, with specific rules for carts, carriages, litters, and even wheelbarrows. Each type of vehicle had different restrictions about where it could go, when it could be used, and what it could carry. Commercial vehicles had different regulations than private vehicles, and the penalties for violating these transportation laws could include fines, confiscation of vehicles, and temporary or permanent bans from using certain streets or entering certain parts of the city. The legal framework for road maintenance and construction created a system of shared responsibility between government authorities and private property owners that was enforced through detailed legal requirements and regular inspections. Property owners were legally required to maintain the sections of road that bordered their land, including responsibilities for cleaning, repairs, and snow removal in applicable regions. Failure to maintain roads properly could result in fines and legal liability if poor road conditions caused accidents or injuries to other citizens. The famous Roman roads that connected the empire were governed by comprehensive legal codes that specified construction standards, maintenance requirements, and usage regulations that applied throughout the empire. These roads were considered so important to imperial administration and military effectiveness that they were protected by special laws that made damaging roads a serious crime. Even minor damage to road surfaces, mile markers, or roadside facilities could result in severe penalties, including heavy fines, forced labor on road repair projects, or imprisonment. Road tolls and travel taxes were regulated by complex legal frameworks that varied by region, but were designed to fund road maintenance while controlling the movement of people and goods throughout the empire. Merchants, travelers, and even government officials sometimes had to pay tolls or obtain travel permits to use certain roads or pass through certain territories. These requirements created extensive bureaucratic systems with their own legal procedures, courts, and enforcement mechanisms. The legal status of roadside inns and services was carefully regulated to ensure that travelers had access to necessary accommodations while preventing fraud and maintaining public order. Inn operators were licensed professionals who had to meet specific legal requirements about the quality of their accommodations, the services they provided, and the prices they charged. There were laws about food safety at inns, security for guests' property, and appropriate behavior by both innkeepers and their customers. There were also odd laws about animals within the city that reflected both practical concerns about public health and safety and complex religious and cultural attitudes toward different species. Certain animals were prohibited from being brought within Rome's sacred boundary, called the pomerium, while others were required for specific religious ceremonies and civic functions. These restrictions weren't just about preventing disease or maintaining cleanliness. They were deeply connected to Roman religious beliefs and legal traditions that treated the city itself as a sacred space with its own spiritual requirements. The laws about sacrificial animals were particularly detailed and reflected the central role that animal sacrifice played in Roman religious and civic life. Legal codes specified not just what animals could be sacrificed to which gods, but also what color they had to be, what age, what gender, and even what physical condition and appearance. A priest who sacrificed the wrong type of animal, or an animal that didn't meet the detailed legal specifications, could face serious legal and religious consequences, including fines, removal from office, and requirements to repeat the entire ceremony with appropriate animals. The legal requirements for sacrificial animals created a specialized livestock industry that was heavily regulated by government authorities. Animal dealers who supplied sacrificial beasts had to be licensed and were subject to regular inspections to ensure that their animals met the detailed legal requirements for various religious ceremonies. There were laws about how sacrificial animals should be housed, fed, and cared for before sacrifice, with specific requirements that varied depending on which deity the animal would be offered to and what type of ceremony was planned. Domestic animals within the city were subject to detailed regulations about their care, control, and disposal. There were laws about keeping livestock in urban areas, with different rules for different types of animals and different areas of the city. Dogs were particularly regulated, with legal requirements about their registration, control, and the liability of their owners for any damage or injuries they caused. Some areas of the city prohibited certain types of animals entirely, while others allowed them only under specific conditions with proper permits and inspections. The legal treatment of stray animals was complex and reflected Roman attitudes about property rights, public health, and social responsibility. Stray dogs and cats could be captured and disposed of by city officials, but there were specific procedures that had to be followed and opportunities for owners to reclaim their animals before they were destroyed. The laws about animal abandonment made it a crime to simply release unwanted animals in the city, requiring owners to follow specific procedures for disposing of animals they could no longer care for. Working animals like horses, oxen, and donkeys were subject to detailed welfare laws that required appropriate care, feeding, and housing. These weren't just moral guidelines, they were legally enforceable requirements with specific penalties for owners who mistreated their animals. The laws recognized that working animals were valuable property and essential to the city's economic functioning, so protecting them from abuse and neglect was seen as a matter of public interest as well as private concern. Exotic animals presented special legal challenges that required unique regulatory approaches. Wild animals brought to Rome for gladiatorial games, public spectacles, or private collections were subject to extensive laws about their capture, transportation, housing, and display. The importation of exotic animals was regulated by customs laws and safety requirements, and there were detailed legal procedures for handling dangerous animals that posed risks to public safety. Even the disposal of dead exotic animals was regulated, with specific requirements about how their carcasses should be handled to prevent disease and maintain public health. The Romans had fascinating laws about names and naming conventions that seem almost bureaucratic in their specificity, but reflected deep cultural values about identity, social status, and family relationships. Roman citizens typically had 3 names: a praenomen, personal name, nomen, family name, and cognomen, additional name. And there were strict legal requirements about how these names could be used, changed, and inherited. The naming system wasn't just a matter of personal choice or family tradition. It was regulated by law and carried significant legal implications for citizenship rights, inheritance, and social standing. There were also laws about what names could be given to children, with certain names being reserved for specific families, social classes, or regional groups. Some names were prohibited entirely because of their associations with disgraced individuals or families, while others were restricted to descendants of particular lineages. The legal approval process for unusual or foreign names could be complex and sometimes required petitions to magistrates or even higher authorities depending on the specific circumstances and the proposed name's implications. The naming laws for freed slaves were particularly complex and reflected the Romans' attempts to integrate former slaves into citizen society while maintaining clear markers of their origins and status. Slaves who were freed had specific legal requirements about what names they could adopt, typically including elements of their former master's name combined with their original slave name or a new chosen name. These naming conventions weren't just social customs, they were legal requirements that affected the freed person's rights, obligations, and social recognition throughout the empire. Women's names followed different legal patterns than men's names and were subject to their own specific regulations and restrictions. Roman women typically had fewer names than men, and their naming patterns reflected their relationships to male family members rather than independent identity. The legal implications of women's names were significant for matters like inheritance, marriage contracts, and family recognition, but women had limited ability to change or modify their names independently of male relatives' decisions. The legal procedures for changing names were complex and varied depending on the reason for the change, the social status of the individual, and the specific names involved. Adoption typically required name changes that followed specific legal formulas, while marriage might involve name modifications that reflected new family relationships. Some name changes required formal legal proceedings with witnesses and official documentation, while others could be accomplished through simpler administrative procedures. Professional names and titles were also regulated by law, with specific requirements about who could use certain professional designations and under what circumstances. Teachers, doctors, lawyers, and other professionals had legal restrictions about the titles they could use and the names they could practice under. False representation of professional credentials through inappropriate names or titles was a criminal offense that could result in fines, professional bans, and other legal consequences. The legal recognition of foreign names and naming conventions created complex challenges as the Roman Empire expanded to include diverse populations with different cultural traditions. Roman law had to accommodate local naming customs while maintaining imperial administrative requirements and legal consistency. The result was a patchwork system where some foreign names were fully recognized, others were modified to fit Roman patterns, and still others were replaced entirely with Roman equivalents. Religious names and titles were subject to their own specialized legal frameworks that connected naming rights to religious authority and ceremonial roles. Priests, priestesses, and other religious officials had specific naming requirements that reflected their sacred duties and social positions. Some religious names were hereditary and carried legal obligations that passed from generation to generation, while others were earned through appointment or achievement and carried specific rights and responsibilities. Gladiatorial games, one of Rome's most famous institutions, were governed by an incredibly complex set of laws and regulations that controlled every aspect of these deadly entertainments, from the training of fighters to the conduct of spectators. There were legal requirements about what types of gladiators could fight against each other, creating detailed matchmaking rules that specified appropriate combinations based on fighting styles, weapons, experience levels, and even physical characteristics. These weren't just suggestions for exciting contests. They were legally mandated requirements that event organizers had to follow or face significant penalties. The weapons that gladiators could use were strictly regulated by law, with detailed specifications about blade lengths, shield sizes, armor types, and protective equipment. Each category of gladiator had legally defined equipment requirements that couldn't be modified without official approval. And using inappropriate or illegal weapons could result in the cancellation of entire events and legal consequences for the organizers. The quality and condition of gladiatorial equipment was subject to regular inspection by official authorities who had the power to condemn substandard gear and require expensive replacements. The timing of gladiatorial contests was also regulated by law, with specific requirements about what time of day certain types of contests could take place, how long individual fights could last, and what intervals were required between different events. Some types of gladiatorial contests were prohibited during certain religious festivals or civic occasions, while others were required as part of specific celebrations. The scheduling of games required official approval and had to conform to complex legal calendars that balanced entertainment with religious and civic obligations. The laws also regulated who could become a gladiator, with different legal pathways for slaves, criminals, prisoners of war, and free volunteers. While many gladiators were slaves or condemned criminals who had no choice in their fate, there were also legal provisions for free citizens who voluntarily became gladiators, though they had to meet specific legal requirements and follow particular procedures to enter this profession. Volunteers had to formally renounce certain legal rights and social privileges, essentially accepting a form of legal death that stripped them of normal citizenship protections. The legal status of gladiators themselves was particularly peculiar and reflected Roman ambivalence about these popular but morally questionable entertainments. Gladiators were technically considered to be infamous under Roman law, meaning they had lost certain legal rights and social standing simply by entering the profession. This legal infamy affected their ability to vote, hold office, serve as witnesses in certain legal proceedings, and marry into respectable families. However, successful gladiators could become wealthy and famous, creating a strange contradiction where someone could be legally infamous but socially celebrated and financially successful. The schools where gladiators trained, called ludi, were subject to extensive legal regulation that covered everything from their physical facilities to their training methods to their financial operations. These schools were licensed operations that had to meet specific legal standards for housing, feeding, and training their gladiators. The owners of gladiatorial schools, called lanistae, were themselves subject to legal restrictions and social stigma, despite often being wealthy and influential businessmen. They had legal obligations to provide appropriate training, medical care, and equipment for their gladiators while also ensuring that their operations didn't pose threats to public order. The legal framework governing gladiatorial schools included detailed requirements about security, as these facilities housed large numbers of trained fighters who could potentially pose threats if they escaped or rebelled. The famous revolt led by Spartacus in 73 BCE led to additional legal restrictions and security requirements that made gladiatorial schools subject to regular military inspections and oversight. School owners had legal liability for any crimes or disturbances caused by their gladiators, creating strong incentives for tight control and careful management of these potentially dangerous assets. Medical care for gladiators was surprisingly sophisticated and was regulated by law to ensure that valuable fighting slaves received appropriate treatment for their injuries. Gladiatorial schools were required to employ qualified doctors and maintain medical facilities that met specific legal standards. The treatment of injured gladiators wasn't just a matter of humanitarian concern. It was a legal requirement that protected the significant financial investments that owners had made in training and equipping their fighters. The retirement and release of gladiators was governed by complex legal procedures that varied depending on how the gladiator had entered the profession and what type of performance record they had achieved. Gladiators who survived long enough could earn their freedom through the traditional ceremony of receiving a wooden sword called a rudis. But this process required official approval and legal documentation. Some retired gladiators became trainers or school operators themselves, while others attempted to reintegrate into normal society, despite the social stigma and legal restrictions that continued to affect them even after retirement. The legal status of gladiators themselves was peculiar and created unique legal situations that had no parallels in other areas of Roman society. They were technically considered to be infamous under Roman law, meaning they had lost certain legal rights and social standing simply by entering the profession, regardless of how or why they had become gladiators. This legal infamy was permanent and affected every aspect of their lives, both during and after their gladiatorial careers. However, successful gladiators could become wealthy and famous, with some earning enough money to buy luxurious homes, expensive clothing, and even their own slaves, creating a strange contradiction where someone could be legally infamous but socially celebrated and financially successful. The legal restrictions on gladiators extended far beyond their professional lives and affected their personal relationships, business dealings, and family arrangements in ways that created complex legal situations. Gladiators couldn't legally marry freeborn citizens, though they could form relationships that were recognized in limited ways by law and custom. Their children faced legal complications related to their father's infamous status, though some of these restrictions could be overcome through legal procedures and imperial favor. Gladiators couldn't serve as witnesses in certain types of legal proceedings, vote in elections, or hold public office, even if they had been born as free citizens before entering the arena. The financial arrangements surrounding gladiatorial combat were governed by detailed legal codes that controlled everything from fighter contracts to prize money to betting procedures. Gladiators who were slaves had complex legal relationships with their owners that determined how prize money and gifts from admirers would be distributed. Free gladiators had different contractual arrangements that specified their obligations, compensation, and legal protections, though these contracts were heavily regulated by law to prevent exploitation and ensure public safety. The legal framework for betting on gladiatorial contests was particularly complex and changed frequently, as authorities attempted to balance the popular demand for wagering with concerns about corruption and social disorder. Some periods saw extensive legal restrictions on betting, while others allowed more open wagering under regulated conditions. Professional bookmakers were licensed and regulated, and there were laws about what types of bets were legal, how odds should be calculated, and what procedures should be followed for settling disputes about contest outcomes. Gladiatorial schools were required to maintain detailed legal records about their fighters, including documentation of their origins, training, medical history, and performance records. These records served multiple legal purposes. They helped establish ownership and legal status, provided evidence for insurance and liability purposes, and created official documentation that could be used in legal proceedings. The accuracy and completeness of these records was legally required and subject to government inspection and verification. The legal procedures for organizing gladiatorial games were elaborate and required extensive documentation, official approvals, and compliance with numerous regulations. Event organizers had to obtain permits, post bonds, hire qualified officials, and meet detailed safety and security requirements. The costs of compliance with these legal requirements made gladiatorial games extremely expensive to organize, limiting them primarily to wealthy individuals, government officials, and imperial authorities who could afford the complex legal and logistical requirements. Insurance and liability laws for gladiatorial events were sophisticated for their time and reflected the significant financial risks involved in these dangerous entertainments. School owners, event organizers, and venue operators all faced potential legal liability for injuries and deaths that occurred during games, leading to complex insurance arrangements and legal protections. The division of liability between different parties involved in organizing games was carefully defined by law and frequently resulted in legal disputes when things went wrong. The legal treatment of gladiatorial deaths was unique and reflected the complex moral and legal status of these events in Roman society. Deaths in the arena weren't considered murders in the normal legal sense, but they were still subject to legal scrutiny and regulation. There were laws about how gladiatorial deaths should be investigated, documented, and reported to authorities. The disposal of gladiators' bodies was regulated by specific legal procedures that differed from normal funeral laws and reflected the infamous status of the deceased. Religious laws in ancient Rome were numerous and often bizarre to modern eyes, reflecting a complex system of beliefs and practices that the Romans saw as essential to maintaining the favor of the gods and ensuring the continued success of the empire. The Romans practiced what scholars call contractual religion. They believed that if they performed the right rituals in exactly the right way, following every detail of traditional procedures, the gods would be obligated to help them in return. This transactional approach to religion led to incredibly detailed religious laws about how ceremonies had to be conducted, with legal consequences for any deviation from established procedures. If a single word was mispronounced during a religious ceremony, if a gesture was performed incorrectly, if the wrong type of incense was used, or if any other detail was wrong, the entire ceremony might be considered invalid and would have to be started over from the beginning. This requirement for absolute precision in religious matters created a legal framework where religious officials had to be trained not just in theology, but in exact procedural requirements that were as detailed as any secular law code. Priests and other religious officials could face legal consequences for ritual errors that were seen as potentially angering the gods and bringing misfortune to the entire community. The College of Priests, called the Pontiffs, were responsible for interpreting and enforcing religious law, and their decisions could seem arbitrary or strange to ordinary Romans who didn't understand the complex theological reasoning behind religious regulations. There were laws about when certain rituals could be performed, with some ceremonies being restricted to specific times of year, particular phases of the moon, or certain weather conditions. Some religious festivals had legal requirements about what the weather had to be like for certain ceremonies to proceed. Rain, wind, or cloud cover could force the postponement of important religious events until conditions were deemed appropriate by religious authorities. The legal framework for animal sacrifice was particularly complex and detailed, reflecting the central role that these offerings played in Roman religious life. Different gods required different types of animals, and the legal specifications for sacrificial beasts were incredibly precise. The animal's age, sex, color, physical condition, and even temperament were all legally defined for different types of ceremonies. A sacrificial animal that didn't meet the exact legal requirements could invalidate an entire ceremony, potentially requiring the purchase and sacrifice of additional animals to satisfy both legal and religious obligations. The legal procedures for conducting public religious ceremonies were elaborate and required coordination between religious authorities, government officials, and various specialists who provided necessary materials and services. These ceremonies weren't just spiritual events. They were legal proceedings that required official documentation, witness testimony, and compliance with detailed procedural requirements. The failure to follow proper legal procedures could result in religious ceremonies being declared invalid, with potential consequences ranging from personal misfortune to public disasters. Private religious practices were also subject to legal regulation, though these laws were generally less detailed and strictly enforced than those governing public ceremonies. There were laws about what types of private religious activities were permitted, what materials could be used in household shrines, and what religious obligations family members had to each other and to the gods. Some private religious practices were prohibited entirely, particularly those that were seen as foreign, immoral, or potentially subversive to Roman authority and traditional values. The Romans also had laws about cursing and swearing that were tied to religious beliefs and legal concepts about the power of words to cause harm. Certain curses were considered legally actionable, while others were protected as legitimate religious expression or acceptable social behavior. The legal distinction between acceptable and unacceptable cursing was complex and often depended on factors like the social status of the people involved, the specific words used, and the context in which the cursing occurred. There were laws about defictiones, curse tablets that people would bury in graves or throw into sacred springs to ask the gods to harm their enemies or competitors. While the practice was generally legal and widely accepted as a normal part of Roman religious life, There were restrictions on what could be cursed and how these curses could be phrased. Some types of curse tablets were prohibited because they requested illegal actions like murder or theft, while others were restricted because they targeted government officials or religious authorities in ways that were seen as potentially treasonous. The legal treatment of religious oaths and vows was sophisticated and reflected the Romans' belief in the binding power of promises made to the gods. Religious oaths had legal force that could be enforced in secular courts, and breaking such oaths could result in both religious and civil penalties. The procedures for making religious vows were legally regulated to ensure that they were binding and enforceable, while also providing some protections against vows that were made under duress or without proper understanding of their implications. The College of Priests, called the Pontiffs, were responsible for interpreting and enforcing religious law, and their decisions could seem arbitrary or strange. There were laws about when certain rituals could be performed, what animals could be sacrificed when, and even what the weather had to be like for certain ceremonies. Some religious festivals had legal requirements about what citizens had to do or couldn't do during the festival period. Work might be prohibited, certain foods forbidden, or specific types of clothing required. The Romans also had laws about cursing and swearing that were tied to religious beliefs. Certain curses were considered legally actionable, while others were protected as religious expression. There were laws about defixions, curse tablets that people would bury or throw into sacred springs, and while the practice was generally legal, there were restrictions on what could be cursed and how. Property laws in ancient Rome included some truly odd provisions that reflected the complexities of Roman society. For example, there were different legal categories for different types of property, and the laws governing each type could be completely different. There were special laws about finding treasure. If you found buried treasure on your own land, you could keep it. But if you found it on someone else's land, the law required specific procedures for dividing it between the finder and the landowner. The Romans had peculiar laws about water rights that were incredibly detailed and specific. Since Roman cities depended on complex aqueduct systems, there were extensive legal regulations about water usage, distribution, and maintenance. Private citizens could sometimes obtain legal rights to tap into public water systems, but the procedures were complex and the regulations numerous. There were laws about what you could and couldn't do with water once you had legal access to it, including restrictions on certain uses and requirements for sharing with neighbors under specific circumstances. Boundary laws were another area where Roman legal thinking produced some odd results. The Romans were obsessed with precise boundary definitions, and there were elaborate legal procedures for establishing and maintaining property boundaries. There were professional boundary inspectors whose job was to interpret and enforce these laws, and disputes over even tiny amounts of land could result in lengthy legal proceedings. Some boundary laws required specific rituals to be performed when establishing new boundaries, including religious ceremonies and the burial of specific objects at boundary markers. The legal system itself had some bizarre features that would seem strange today. For instance, there were laws about how trials had to be conducted, including requirements about what time of day they could begin, what the weather had to be like, and even what direction the judge had to face. Some types of legal proceedings could only take place on certain days of the year, as determined by religious calendar requirements. Roman inheritance laws were particularly complex and included some odd provisions. There were legal requirements about who could inherit what, but these weren't just based on family relationships. They also took into account social status, profession, and even moral behavior. Some wills included bizarre legal conditions that heirs had to fulfill to receive their inheritance, such as performing specific rituals, maintaining certain behaviors, or even marrying particular people. The Romans also had laws about tomb monuments and burial practices that were incredibly detailed. There were legal requirements about how elaborate your tomb could be based on your social status, what materials you could use, and where you could build it. Some of these laws were motivated by practical concerns. Rome's growing population needed space, and elaborate tombs took up valuable land. But others seemed to be about maintaining social hierarchies even in death. Slavery laws in ancient Rome were extensive and often contradictory, reflecting the central role that slavery played in Roman society, while also revealing some of the moral tensions it created. There were laws about how slaves could be treated, what rights they had, very few, and under what circumstances they could be freed. But there were also odd laws about the behavior expected of freed slaves. Former slaves had specific legal obligations to their former masters that could last for generations. Some slavery laws were surprisingly specific about particular situations. For example, there were laws about what happened if a slave was injured by someone other than their owner, how damages should be calculated, and who could collect compensation. There were also laws about slave marriages. While slaves couldn't legally marry, they could form relationships that were recognized in certain limited ways, and there were legal procedures for what happened to these relationships when slaves were sold or freed. The Romans had laws about public bathing that reflected both practical concerns about hygiene and complex social hierarchies. Roman baths were important social institutions, but they were also governed by numerous legal regulations. There were laws about who could use which baths at what times, what behavior was acceptable in the baths, and how the baths should be maintained and operated. Some laws required separate bathing times for men and women, while others regulated mixed bathing under specific circumstances. Educational laws in ancient Rome were less formal than in modern societies, but there were still legal regulations about teaching and learning. There were laws about who could work as a teacher, what subjects could be taught, and under what circumstances. Some laws restricted certain types of education to specific social classes, while others regulated the behavior of teachers and students. The famous law schools of Rome had their own internal regulations that had the force of law for their students and faculty. Roman military laws produced some of the most severe and strange legal requirements in the ancient world. Military discipline was incredibly strict, and there were laws about every aspect of military life, from how soldiers should march to what they could eat. Some military laws seem almost absurdly detailed. There were regulations about how tents should be pitched, what direction they should face, and how the camp should be laid out. Breaking these laws, even in minor ways, could result in severe punishment. The famous Roman military punishment of decimation, where every 10th soldier in a unit would be executed for cowardice, was a legal procedure with specific requirements about how it should be carried out. There were also laws about military equipment, requiring soldiers to maintain their gear in specific ways and face penalties for losing or damaging their weapons and armor. Roman laws about public entertainment extended far beyond gladiatorial games to include regulations about theater, music, and other performances. There were laws about what types of plays could be performed, what topics actors could address, and even what costumes they could wear. Some laws prohibited certain types of music or dancing as being too foreign or morally corrupting. Street performers and entertainers were regulated by law, with requirements for licenses and restrictions on where and when they could perform. The Romans had extensive laws about public order that covered everything from noise regulations to crowd control. There were laws about when you could make loud noises, what constitutes disturbing the peace, and how public gatherings should be managed. Some of these laws were surprisingly modern in concept. There were noise ordinances that prohibited certain activities during sleeping hours, and laws about public cleanliness that required citizens to maintain the areas in front of their homes. Roman tax laws were notoriously complex and often seemed arbitrary to those who had to pay them. There were taxes on almost everything: property, inheritance, sales, and even bachelors. The famous bachelor tax was imposed on unmarried men over a certain age, based on the theory that they weren't contributing to society by producing children. There were also luxury taxes on expensive items, and these could be quite specific. There might be different tax rates for different grades of the same product. The collection of taxes was often contracted out to private tax farmers, and there were laws governing how they could collect taxes and what methods they could use. Some of these laws were supposed to protect citizens from abuse, but they were often ignored or poorly enforced. The result was a system where tax collection could seem completely arbitrary and unfair to ordinary Romans. Roman laws about foreign residents and visitors were complex and could change dramatically based on political circumstances. There were laws about what rights foreigners had, what obligations they had to follow Roman law, and under what circumstances they could become Roman citizens. Some laws were quite welcoming to foreign merchants and traders, recognizing the economic benefits they brought. Others were much more restrictive, particularly during times of military conflict. The Romans also had laws about diplomatic immunity that were quite sophisticated for their time. Foreign ambassadors had specific legal protections, but these came with detailed requirements about their behavior and activities while in Roman territory. Breaking these diplomatic laws could have serious consequences for relations between Rome and other nations. Roman marriage laws included some provisions that seem almost romantic by ancient standards, but others that seem quite cold and calculating. There were laws about dowries that required specific procedures for how they should be handled, what happened to them if the marriage ended, and how they should be passed on to children. Some marriage laws were designed to encourage certain types of unions. For example, there were legal benefits for marrying within your social class and penalties for marrying outside it. The Romans also had laws about adoption that were quite liberal by ancient standards. Adoption was common among wealthy Romans as a way to ensure inheritance and family continuity, but the legal procedures were complex and specific. There were laws about what age someone had to be to adopt, what requirements adoptees had to meet, and what legal changes occurred when adoption took place. Roman laws about public works and infrastructure were extensive, reflecting the empire's famous engineering achievements. There were laws about road construction and maintenance, requiring property owners to contribute to upkeep of roads that bordered their land. There were also laws about public buildings, specifying how they should be built, maintained, and used. Some of these laws included requirements for public amenities. Certain buildings had to include specific features like fountains or public latrines. The famous Roman roads were governed by detailed legal codes that specified how wide they should be, what materials should be used in their construction, and how they should be maintained. There were laws about who could use the roads and under what circumstances, as well as regulations about roadside inns and services for travelers. Roman laws about personal hygiene might seem intrusive by modern standards, but reflected practical concerns about public health in crowded ancient cities. There were laws about waste disposal that required citizens to follow specific procedures for getting rid of garbage and human waste. There were also laws about public sanitation that made property owners responsible for keeping the streets in front of their buildings clean. Some hygiene laws were quite specific about personal cleanliness requirements for people in certain professions. Food handlers had to follow particular cleanliness procedures, and there were laws about how often people in certain jobs had to bathe. These laws weren't just suggestions. They were enforced with fines and other penalties. The Romans had laws about gambling that were complex and often contradictory. While some forms of gambling were completely prohibited, others were legal under specific circumstances. There were laws about dice games, betting on chariot races, and other forms of wagering. The legal status of gambling often depended on your social class. Activities that were illegal for ordinary citizens might be perfectly legal for the wealthy elite. Some gambling laws were quite detailed about specific games and betting practices. There were regulations about what could be wagered, how bets should be placed, and what happened if there were disputes about gambling outcomes. Professional gambling was regulated differently from casual betting, and there were laws about gambling houses and their operations. Roman sumptuary laws extended to housing as well as clothing and food. There were regulations about how elaborate your house could be based on your social status, what materials you could use in construction, and even how your house should be decorated. Some laws prohibited certain architectural features for people below specific social ranks, while others required wealthy citizens to include particular amenities in their homes. There were also laws about urban planning that required houses to be built in certain ways to maintain public safety and order. Some laws regulated building heights, while others specified how much space had to be left between buildings. Property owners had legal obligations about maintaining their buildings and ensuring they didn't pose hazards to neighbors or passers-by. Roman laws about festivals and holidays were numerous and detailed, reflecting the importance of religious and civic celebrations in Roman life. There were laws about what activities were required or prohibited during specific festivals, how public celebrations should be conducted, and what role different social classes should play in holiday observances. Some festivals had laws requiring all citizens to participate in certain activities, while others prohibited specific types of work or behavior. The Roman calendar itself was regulated by law, with specific procedures for determining when holidays would occur and how long they would last. The pontiffs had legal authority over calendar decisions, and their choices could have significant impacts on business, legal proceedings, and daily life throughout the empire. As we near the end of our journey through the bizarre legal landscape of ancient Rome, it becomes clear that these weren't just arbitrary rules created by bored lawmakers. Each of these strange laws reflected deeper concerns about social order, moral behavior, religious obligation, and practical governance in a vast and diverse empire. The Romans believed that law should regulate every aspect of human behavior, from the most public and political to the most private and personal. What makes these laws particularly fascinating is how they reveal the tensions and contradictions within Roman society. Laws about luxury and display reflected anxiety about moral decay, while also showing off the wealth that made Rome powerful. Laws about social hierarchy revealed both the Romans' obsession with status and their recognition that these distinctions needed legal enforcement to be maintained. Laws about religion showed both genuine belief and calculating political manipulation. Many of these Roman laws influenced legal systems that came after, though thankfully most of the stranger provisions didn't survive. Modern legal systems around the world still show traces of Roman legal thinking, particularly in areas like property rights, contracts, and civil procedure. But the Roman approach to regulating personal behavior and moral conduct through law largely disappeared as societies developed different approaches to governance and individual freedom. Understanding these ancient laws helps us appreciate both how much and how little human nature has changed over the centuries. Romans worried about many of the same things we worry about today: social inequality, moral behavior, public safety, and economic fairness. Their solutions might seem strange or extreme to us, but they reflected genuine attempts to create order and justice in their world. The legacy of Roman law is still with us today, but filtered through centuries of development and change. While we no longer have laws requiring specific hairstyles or prohibiting certain colors of clothing, we still grapple with questions about how much government should regulate personal behavior and how law should reflect social values. The Romans' detailed approach to legal regulation might seem excessive, but it represents one of humanity's most thorough attempts to create a comprehensive legal system. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you can imagine what it would have been like to live under these strange and comprehensive Roman laws, navigating a world where your clothing, your dinner guests, your morning routine, and even your hairstyle were all matters of legal concern. Rest easy, knowing that while our modern laws might sometimes seem complex, at least you don't have to worry about being fined for wearing the wrong shade of purple or inviting too many friends to dinner. Sleep well and good night.